With tensions rising in the West Bank, disturbing videos showing the moment two Palestinian boys are shot dead by the Israeli military. The IDF launching what they called a counter-terror raid in the town of Jenin that Israel sees as a hotbed of terrorism. The IDF conducting operations there long before this war began. 8-year-old Adam Sama Al-Ghul and 15-year-old Basil Suleiman Abu Al-Wafa both killed.
Now, unfortunately, violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank doesn't simply come from IDF soldiers. They have been experiencing violence from Israeli settlers for quite some time now. This is not new. Unfortunately, that violence has risen considerably following the terrorist attacks that happened in Israel on October 7th, carried out by Hamas. Those atrocities have emboldened these settlers who believe that they should be allowed to build illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. And now we have an investigation done by the Washington Post in regard to one of the recent clashes between Palestinians and settlers in the West Bank. And unfortunately, it happened to be one of the most deadly instances of that violence breaking out. So I want to give you those details because that deadliest instance of Israeli settler violence in the West Bank resulted in the death of 3 Palestinians, including 1 teenager. And again, this particular instance was investigated by the Washington Post, and this is one of those examples of fantastic journalistic work, fantastic investigative reporting. Washington Post isn't perfect. Obviously, we criticize them when we feel that it's necessary, but in this case, they do deserve a lot of credit for doing this investigation. Now, the displacement and Palestinian death toll in the occupied West Bank kind of gives you a sense of the type of violence that has been directed toward the Palestinian community, and it's being done with impunity for the perpetrators. Now, in the month after the October 7th Hamas attack, more than 800 Palestinians were displaced from their West Bank homes amid increased violence by the radical Israeli settler movement, which has long held the aim of expelling Palestinians and expanding the Jewish footprint in the occupied territories. And look, I want to be clear about something. You have this far-right Israeli government, you have the Israeli settlers who have been emboldened by the far-right Netanyahu government. But I don't want anyone to make the mistake in thinking that the settlers are representative of the Israeli population. You see interviews with normal Israelis in Israel, and they tend to give the settler community the side eye. They see them as extremists. And in the past, with previous governments, there was more of an effort to hold them accountable when they carry out these acts of violence against Palestinians living in the West Bank. But increasingly, that has not been the case. And thanks to the latest round of fighting between Israel and Hamas, again, that has essentially created the situation in which the settlers have felt more emboldened to carry out these acts of violence. Now, I gave you a sense of how many Palestinians have been displaced recently from the West Bank, but it's worth getting into the number of individuals who have been killed. Between October 7th and January 4th of this year, more than 300 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank by Israeli troops or settlers, a dramatic increase in the rate of killing in the last months of 2023, the deadliest year since the United Nations began recording casualties in 2005. Now again, the deadliest instance as of late had to do with settlers specifically attacking someone's home, a Palestinian home in the West Bank. And then when 3 individuals attempted to protect the residents of that home and the home itself, unfortunately, they were met with gunfire. And so this is what the Washington Post decided to investigate, and their investigation alleges that the Israeli Defense Forces essentially stood by and did nothing to protect the Palestinians who were met with this violence. And if you're wondering, well, is the IDF supposed to do something? I mean, the IDF represents the best interests of Israel, right? No, in this case, they actually are tasked with providing protection for the Palestinian population in the occupied West Bank. I know that is a naive thing to believe is actually happening, but again, the situation has devolved even further thanks to this latest round of fighting between Israel and Hamas. Even worse, the perpetrators, according to the Washington Post, have gone unpunished. So let's talk about that incident. Let's talk about what happened. It occurred on October 9th, and the Palestinian residents of Qusra in the occupied West Bank had received some threats on social media. This is what the threats had said. To all the rats in the sewers of Qusra village, we are waiting for you and we will have no mercy. The day of revenge is coming. 2 days later, a group of masked and armed Israeli settlers struck the village in what would be the deadliest attack by settlers in the West Bank since the Israel-Gaza war began 3 months ago. So that attack began with these settlers intentionally crashing into a car in the area and then shooting at the vehicle following the crash. That's how it started. This is at about 1 p.m. local time. More than a dozen Palestinians fled north to take cover behind a large building and just basically get away from the gunfire that appeared to be coming from the direction of Esh Kodesh toward Qusra. The mass settlers were firing mostly pistols and one M16, which is a popular military style rifle. They left at about 1:30 p.m. after the shooting, after they shot at several residents. Now, based on the reporting, that did not lead to any deaths. But unfortunately, they didn't just simply leave after that shooting at 1:30. An Israeli official with knowledge of the October 11th incident said soldiers heard sounds of gunfire coming from the village and left the outpost. He said soldiers reported the incident and then saw friction between settlers and Palestinians in the area. They called for other forces who came and separated the groups. And luckily they did that. They separated the groups, but unfortunately it didn't end there. I saw on the security cameras, there were settlers around our home destroying cars and shooting at windows. We hid in the house and they tried to get in and they shot and swore at anyone they saw. That's a statement from a Palestinian in the West Bank by the name of Awad Odeh. And he's relevant to this story. As soon as we got 10 to 15 meters out of our home, they shot at my family and injured my daughter, and I got shot right after. It was like an action movie. I didn't expect to come out alive. I have never been in a position like this. So in the end, there were 3 Palestinians who were killed because the settlers didn't simply disperse after the troops came in and separated the 2 groups at around 1:30 p.m. local time. They ended up coming back. And so I want to talk about the individuals who were killed. I want to name them and I want to talk about what happened after they were shot and killed. One of the Palestinians killed was a teenager, as I mentioned earlier, a 17-year-old by the name of Syed Abu Sroor. Abu Sroor was shot in the back according to a photo and his medical records, which revealed that the bullet exited from the upper middle of the chest, causing bleeding and destroying the lungs. Another person who was killed by the settlers was a new father by the name of Muath Raed Odeh, 29-year-old. He's gone. Odeh ran into the house to try to save Awad's 6-year-old daughter, said a witness who spoke on the condition of anonymity for fear of reprisals. Muath was shot and later died at a hospital. And then there was a third man, a 20-year-old by the name of Musab Abdel Halim Abu Rida. This individual was killed close by to the 17-year-old who was shot and killed. Now again, Israeli troops did not forcibly intervene despite their obligation under international law and Israeli law, by the way, to protect all residents of the West Bank, including Palestinians. Now listen, there had been skirmishes that we had reported on in the past, even prior to this war, that made it abundantly clear that the IDF was doing little to protect Palestinians. But now it feels as though anything goes and there's no protection at all for Palestinians living in the West Bank, which by the way, I I think you know, but just in case you're unaware, the West Bank is obviously different from the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is unfortunately governed by Hamas. In the West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority, which actually had some diplomatic relations with the Israeli government, but it has become very clear that the Israeli government doesn't respect the Palestinian Authority either. In fact, when it comes to what the fate of the Gaza Strip will be, who will govern the Gaza Strip after this war is over, Netanyahu has made clear that he has no interest in allowing the Palestinian Authority to essentially govern that area, the Gaza Strip. And so the bad faith nature of all of this and the treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank who are not governed by Hamas, in my mind, makes it very clear that this current Israeli government really had no interest in allowing for Palestinians to live lives of dignity. And it's just frustrating to see it because, again, you don't have the Hamas excuse in the West Bank. Now, they'll argue that there are Hamas cells within the West Bank, but Hamas has not been elected by the people living in the West Bank. They do not control the West Bank. So to justify some of the attacks on the West Bank by claiming that there are Hamas cells there, I think is ridiculous. You want to go after the Hamas cells, the alleged Hamas cells, by all means do it. But the violence and the illegal settlements that have plagued the West Bank for many, many years gives you a sense of just how much these people have been dealing with, even though they've done nothing wrong, even though they have the right to live in those homes, even though the settlers have no right to build the illegal settlements that they have been building. Nonetheless, soldiers and police were photographed at the scene of the deaths only after the attack ended, even though troops stationed at nearby military outposts were within earshot of the gunfire and had views of an earlier attack by settlers, the visual evidence shows. And that earlier attack was the one that happened around 1 o'clock. They were separated at 1:30. And then the settlers came back to engage in more violence. In practice, there has been a serious problem of implementing the law, said Ronnie Pelly, who's a lawyer with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, who also reviewed the October 11th evidence. There's no doubt that the Israeli army should have stopped it. They should have detained the settlers until the police come and take them. And look, there were some consequences. There were some consequences for those engaged in this violence, and I want to give you a sense of what that consequence looked like. So police said that following the 3 Palestinians getting shot and killed, a 22-year-old resident of Esh Kodesh was arrested on November 7th on suspicion of murder. The 22-year-old was held for about 20 minutes of questioning and then released on a restraining order. A restraining order prohibiting him from going to 2 Palestinian villages and from contacting 22 individuals. No prison time for literally gunning down, slaughtering, killing 3 innocent people. 3 innocent people who were trying to protect a Palestinian family's home from getting attacked from those settlers. And the reality is that settlers have been emboldened to carry out this violence, and they've been emboldened by Netanyahu and the current far-right government that's in power in Israel right now. In fact, I want to give you a very specific example of what Netanyahu has done to embolden settler violence in the West Bank. Let's watch.
Zvi Sukkot is a member of Israel's parliament, representing the far-right religious Zionist party. He's become a prominent voice in the movement to expand Israeli settlements. Sukkot first started making headlines more than a decade ago as a member of the Hilltop Youth, young Israelis who would squat areas of the West Bank with the hope of claiming the land for eventual new settlements. In 2012, Israel's security agency accused him of leading covert and violent activity against Palestinians, and he was temporarily banned from entering the West Bank. But after October 7th, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appointed him to lead a committee handling security issues in the territory.
He's in charge of security in the territory. The guy who doesn't believe that Palestinians have a right to be in the occupied West Bank. The guy who thinks it's okay for settlers to build the illegal settlements, to squat on Palestinian territory and Palestinian land. That's the guy that Netanyahu has allowed to take charge of security in the West Bank. This is obviously deeply, deeply immoral. It is unfair to the Palestinian population living in the occupied West Bank, which should not be occupied in the first place. And to be quite frank, it's deeply unfair to the Israeli civilians who are being led by a government that is creating an environment in which these individuals are going to be less safe. Because these are the types of policies, this is the type of terror that Palestinians have been dealing with for so long that unfortunately breeds the type of extremism that leads to the kinds of attacks that Israeli civilians have unfortunately suffered. And so it's not fair for anyone involved, and it does not make for a safe environment in the region. And when you look at policies that have failed time and time again, you would want to believe that maybe, just maybe, those in charge would recalibrate, would reconsider, would think about handling this conflict and this ongoing war in a way that actually leads to peace. But if you're going to brutalize a population of people, if you're going to trample over their rights and steal their land that is internationally recognized as a region that belongs to the Palestinian people, I'm talking about the West Bank, then you're never gonna have peace because that extremism will continue to reproduce. It'll continue to happen. And it's not right for the innocent civilians involved on both sides. It's incredibly frustrating to see that failed policies keep getting repeated, but here we are. And thank you to the Washington Post for actually investigating this story and looking into whether the IDF did what the IDF is supposed to do by law. Provide protection for the Palestinian population in the occupied West Bank, knowing full well that they are met with violence by these extremists, these settlers.
Thanks for watching the video, guys. We also love it if you hit the join button below because that makes you a member, and members allow us to be independent, honest. We can be as progressive as we want, no corporate media influence, and that's all because of you guys. We love doing the show with our members. Hit the join button, become one of the Young Turks.